Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stacy Brown, and I'll be your instructor for the next 2 hours. I have been with Brittenford for 7 years, and I'm a Microsoft certified professional in GP. I've completed several GP implementations and upgrades and provide GP support for Brittenford clients. Today, we'll be reviewing some AP advanced topics, which include setup and post scheduled payments, placing and removing vendor and document holds, editing posted transactions, voiding open and historical transactions. We'll review the batch recovery window. We'll talk about processing 1099s and printing your 1096 forms, reconciling payables data, and completing the year-end procedures. Before we get into the topics, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to ask them through the chat that's going to be found in the lower left-hand corner of the link window here. If you click on the little message icon, the window will pop up and you can type like you would with Instant Messenger. I'll review the questions at the end of each topic and will answer as many as I can. All right, let's begin. I'm going to expand my window here. The first topic we're going to review today is how to set up scheduled payments. And we're going to first begin by entering in an invoice. So I'm going to expand transactions here. I'm going to go to Payables Transaction Entry. Now, the key to setting up your scheduled payments is there has to be an original invoice for the full amount. So I'm going to suggest we enter an invoice here for our mortgage. Select a vendor. Enter an amount. Check my distributions here. And then normally we'd enter a batch ID, so I'll create a batch. Let's not save it to a batch because I don't want workflow. All right. Why won't? So here it looks like I do have to get this posted. There. And then we're going to set up our schedules. So we're going to go back under transactions and we're going to go to scheduled payments. We're going to enter in a description. We're going to pull up our original invoice. Here, the scheduled document date is the date of the original invoice, and then the schedule amount is going to be the amount remaining on the invoice. Here in the bottom, we have our posting account, so our account payables account defaults for us. We'll need to identify a notes payable account. And then if you are calculating interest expense will be a required account as well. Up here at the top, you'll choose if your interest type is compound or simple. You have your scheduled interest rate. So we'll do 3.5%. You're going to identify the number of payments you'll be making. So if we make 30 payments, your payment frequency is going to be how often you pay the invoice. So we have semi-monthly, monthly, quarterly, semi-annual, and annual. So I'm going to click monthly. Now I'm going to click on this calculate button at the bottom right. And you'll notice it'll give me now the calculated payment amount. So it says I'm going to pay roughly $1,468.42 every month. So the first invoice document date will be 1/30/2014, and the first invoice due date will be 2/28/2014, since my original invoice date was 1/30/2014. If we click on the amortization button over here on the bottom right, you can then see your amortization schedule. So you're seeing when the payment's going to be due, your payment amount, how much is going to principal, the amount going to interest, and the balance of your payments, of the invoice. Click OK here. And then we'll need to click on Post. When clicking on the Post button here, what this does is it moves the original invoice from accounts payable to notes payable. Now we'll need to post each individual invoice and cut the checks from those invoices. So your next step, so if we look here on the screen, here we have our payables transaction posting journal. And you can see here where it's moving out of accounts payable and into our notes payable account. Here's our distribution breakdown. This is our GL distribution summary. And this is our payable schedule payments posting journal. Now that we've posted the scheduled payments, now we're going to need to post each invoice so that it's ready to be paid. So we're going to expand routines over here on the left, and we're going to go to post scheduled payments. Under scheduled payments, you can see here's my schedule that we've created. I can either, if I have multiple schedules, I can restrict to a specific schedule, or I can restrict to a specific vendor. To restrict how many invoices I see here, I can restrict to a certain due date cutoff. So I'm going to put 12/31/2014. Right, and then I'm going to click redisplay. You can see here it's restricted my view to only those invoices that will need to be paid within the 2014 year. So I'm going to mark all of these. You can choose to come in here every month and release the invoice to be paid, or if you have future periods open, you can post them all at one time and then they'll become due when the due date is. So I'm going to just mark all of them. Well, isn't that pleasant? Let's correct that error message. We're going to go to administration here and open the period. Go back to purchasing here. And back to our window. And try that again. There we go. So we're going to mark all of them and then we're going to click post. Here we're going to get the same reports. So here we have each invoice. You can see here it's going back to accounts payable. We have our interest expense being hit for the $122.85, and then it's being taken back out of notes payable. Here's our distribution breakdown summary. So here are all the invoices for the 2014 year. My distribution summary. All right, so now let's go back and look at the vendor inquiry screen. So I'm going to come to the top here and expand inquiry. I'm going to do transaction by vendor. Try AC travel. I'm going to sort by document date here. So we scroll down here to the bottom, near the bottom. You can now see the invoices that are open to be paid. So we're going to now go to routine transactions, excuse me. We're going to look under edit check batch. I'm going to create a new batch. And then you can see here we've got our invoices. Let's see if we have any questions. Does anybody have any questions about scheduled payments? I don't have very many clients that do use it. I do have a few. If they have to make monthly payments, they'll use the scheduled payments window. The next topic we're going to review is placing and removing vendor and transaction holds. First, let's discuss the difference. What's the difference between putting a vendor on hold and what's the difference between putting a transaction on hold? If you're disputing with a vendor on a specific transaction but want to still pay them for other transactions, you're going to want to put the actual transaction on hold. Where if you're disputing with the vendor and you don't want to pay any of their invoices, you'll want to put the vendor on hold. So let's first review how to put a vendor on hold. We're going to go to cards. So I'm going to expand cards here. And I'm going to click on vendor. We'll select our vendor. And then we'll check on hold. Sometimes, depending on your setup of the system, it may ask you for a password. So the password that it will be asking you for is under setup. So I'm going to expand setup and show you here under payables. You have here remove vendor from hold. So if we go into vendor maintenance after we save this, if we want to remove the vendor from hold, it will ask us for a password. Right now I have a module called workflow activated in GP, so it has to go through a submit for approval process. I'm not going to go through that right now, but in most of my client systems they don't have the workflow, and therefore when you uncheck the hold button, it'll ask you for a password, possibly. The password is a system password. So you see here under payables setup, we have a password of access. If anybody knows the password, they can remove the vendor from hold. It's not user specific. If you want to put a transaction on hold, we're going to go to transactions. And under transactions, we're looking for holds. So here near the bottom, we'll select our vendor. We'll select the invoices we want to put on hold, and then we'll click OK. Once we've cleared any disputes with the vendor about that transaction, you simply go back into the holds window, select the vendor, and remove the holds from the transactions. I do want to make it clear that when you put a vendor on hold, it still allows you to enter invoices for that vendor. It just doesn't allow you to pay that vendor. I'm going to take a minute and check to see if we have any questions about vendor holds. Nope, still no questions. Please feel free, if you guys have questions, to submit them into the chat. The next topic we're going to talk about is transactions, editing posted transactions. I don't know if anybody here uses multi-remit to addresses for one vendor, but new in GP 2013, you can now edit the remit to address for a vendor. So I wanted to take this time first and maybe talk about that since it's an advanced topic. A good example I have is I go to client sites often and they'll have 6 Verizon vendors. And I always ask, why do you have 6 Verizon vendors? And they say, well, I've got to pay this Verizon to this payment center, and I've got to pay this Verizon vendor to this payment center. Well, in GP, we have a feature that allows you to have multiple remit to addresses. So if we go under the vendor card here, we review the vendor, you notice they have a primary address. This will automatically default for you. Then here under address IDs, you get to select which address type is your default. So under address IDs, we have remit to, and here there's actually a remit to address. So let's look at that address. So whenever we cut a check, by default, it's going to print to this address form. You can create as many addresses as you want for a vendor. It's unlimited. Once you've saved your remit to addresses, we then have to identify actually on the invoice which remit to address you want to print to. So we're going to go to transaction entry, and when we enter our invoice, wrong vendor. Let's try that again. We can change the remit to ID. Okay, so we can have 5 different remit to addresses, and then as long as on the invoice screen we're identifying which address we're pinning the check to, a check will print to that address. So here we say $100, and then we can post the invoice. Now, when you go to select your checks, if you have one vendor, say Verizon in our case, and you have multiple remit to addresses identified on the invoices, then a separate check will print for each of those remit to addresses. So you don't have to worry about doing a separate check batch for each of those. All right. Now the problem before GP 2013 is if in the transaction entry screen you forgot to change the remit to address to the right one, you would have to void out the invoice completely to correct the remit to address. That's not the case anymore. Now we can just go to transactions and then edit transaction information. We can select the vendor. We can select the document. And then we can change the remit to address if it hasn't already been paid, the discount date, the due date. You can change the PO number information if you want to include that, as well as the description of the invoice. You will notice that you still cannot change the original amount of the invoice or the document date. And if you use multi-currency, you will not be able to change the currency ID. Once you click Save, any changes that you make will be updated on the invoice. Any questions about editing posted transactions? See? Nope, still no questions. The next thing we're going to talk about is voiding open and historical transactions. And before we talk about that, I want to go over the different document types in a vendor document. So you'll notice when we open up this payables inquiry window, so we went under inquiry screen here, and we went to transactions by vendor. You'll notice that we can include 3 document statuses or origins. We have a work, open, and history. Now let's talk about the differences. Work here is anything that is saved but not posted. Okay, so any transactions that you enter and save to a batch, that's going to have an origin of work. Open. Open is anything that has been posted but not fully applied. Okay, so any invoices that you haven't fully paid are going to be in open. If you print a check or a manual payment and you don't apply it to any invoices, that's going to have an origin of open. All right. And then lastly, you have history. And history is going to be anything that's posted and fully applied. So a lot of times you'll see all your check payments here in history, as we see here in this vendor. Okay, it looks like we might have a question. All right, we'll wait a few minutes for that question. All right, so let's talk about voiding open and historical transactions. So we're going to go under purchasing, we're going to expand transactions. And first let's void historical transactions. Usually I run into where clients enter an invoice, they post the invoice, and they pay the invoice. And they want to void, they've made a mistake, they just caught a mistake on the invoice. So they need to void the payment that's applied to the invoice to release the invoice, and then we can void the invoice. So first we're going to go to void historical transactions. Here you can do your lookup by document. So it's good to have the check number that you want to void here. In this window, you'll see your checks, your payment types. You'll see some credit memos here too if they're in history. You'll see the vendor ID, the document amount. You have a void date and a posting date. And some people ask me, well, what's the difference between the two? Your void date is actually the date that affects the payables module here. And then your posting date is the date that it's going to void the posting date of the voided transaction in the general ledger. The key is to have these in the same month or in the same year at least, because when you're reconciling your AP, if your voids are in different months, it'll be a reconciling item for the month. Here you also have the date of the payment number, the vendor name. If you use multi-currency, you'll see different currencies here. You'll also notice that in GP 2013, there's a new field called reconciled. And you can see here none of my payments have been reconciled, but this is an information only field, and it helps those who use that bank rec module to identify whether you've cleared that check already in a bank reconciliation. I've had some people run into issues or get confused because they void a payment that's already been cleared in the bank rec module. So to simply void it, we just check the box. My period is closed for that one, so let's see if we can find one that's open. Here we go. And then you click on void, and this will void the transaction. I'm going to write this vendor down. Inner City 001. And you click void. And then your posting journals will print. And we'll print those to screen. So right here in our historical payables transaction posting journal, we're going to see just the check information, which vendor it is. We'll see the checkbook ID that's associated with the payment and the check amount. You'll also see down here your distribution. So here we just simply have our cash account and our payables account. Next is our checkbook posting journal. You can see the voids. You'll notice anything that has an asterisk beside it is a voided transaction. That's key in Dynamics GP when you're looking at inquiry screens. Once we void the payment, it'll release the invoice to be voided as well or to be repaid. Another key change or new feature in GP 2013 is that when you void a payment for an invoice, and that invoice also had a credit memo applied to it, it releases the credit memo. It unapplies the credit memo from the invoice. So you can either reapply the credit memo to the invoice, or you can apply that credit memo to another invoice. So credit memos are released from invoices in GP 2013 when the payment that is applied to that invoice is voided. So we're going to go, the next topic is to void open transactions. So we're going to go to transactions, void open transactions. We're going to select our vendor here. You'll notice the difference when we were in our void historical transaction window, we actually had to know the document number of the document we are trying to void. Here we can simply select the vendor. Here, like before, we have now our voucher number, the document number to the voucher, the document amount. Again, we have a void date and a posting date. Again, you'll notice the void date is the date that was on the original invoice and the posting date of the original invoice. So you'll want to change those possibly. And then we simply check the void box and click void, and that'll void the invoice. Here you'll notice it has our invoice information. We have a type of invoice. We have our voucher number, the date, vendor ID, our audit trail code, the document amount, all the information that was originally entered in the invoice. That includes our purchase amount, the document number, our tax amount, and then you'll notice here the reversal of our expense accounts, the taxes, and our accounts payable. If we use multi-currency, you get your multi-currency report. And that's voiding transactions. Okay, we have a question here. Within the screen to change posted items, can you change the vendor ID in GP13? To change posted items. You cannot change the vendor ID on a posted transaction. So let's go back to the edit transaction information window. So we're going to transactions, edit transaction information. We'll select our vendor ID. Here you can see that it's grayed out. This is only allowing you to look up the documents. So in GP, the way the edit payables transaction window works is you select the vendor and it's going to restrict the lookup screen to only those vendors' documents. Okay, so if we come back down here, you'll notice the original amount and the document date. If we were to change this vendor to another vendor, you'll notice the document number clears out and we'd only have that vendor's documents that we could change. You would have to void your transaction either in the invoice in your void open transactions window and re-enter the transaction. You'll notice here too when we're actually doing the transaction entry, so when we go to transactions, transaction entry, that when we enter the transaction, and we select the vendor ID, you'll notice that it automatically tabs off the field and the vendor ID is grayed out. So you'd actually have to delete the invoice from and start all over in that situation as well. And we had another question. Do the void date and posting date have to be the same date? They don't have to be the same date. There's two scenarios I usually go with. There's one where my clients, entered a check, applied it to the wrong invoice, so they want to void the check, but it's already been paid out and cleared. In those instances, we allow the void date and posting date to default to what they originally were because we're entering in the check again for the same dates. If you're just voiding the payment and you're not planning to recut a check, I would suggest having the void date and the posting date in the same month, because when you're reconciling AP, if you have a different void date then you do your posting date in the general ledger, that's going to be a reconciling item when you're comparing the two. So for instance, what I'm saying is if you have a void date of, say, May, and you have a posting date of June, when we go to reconcile our AP to GL for May, this void isn't going to hit the general ledger until June. So our GL is going to be off from our AP module by, say, the $300 that we voided in May. Okay, so I do suggest that when you're voiding, that your void date and your posting date are at least in the same month. They don't have to be the exact same date, but I do suggest they be in the same month. All right. The next topic that we're going to cover is batch recovery. Now, batch recovery, you shouldn't have to come to too often. You're going to go to batch recovery if you've got errors in your transactions that you're posting. If your computer crashes while during a posting, you're going to want to go to batch recovery most likely. If the internet goes down when you post or you lose power while you're posting, you most likely will need to go to batch recovery. Most of the time when your system crashes and you log back into GP after you've interrupted your posting, it'll tell you that you need to go back to batch recovery, that the posting process was interrupted. To get to batch recovery, we're going to go to GP, Tools, Routines, and Batch Recovery. Batch recovery is not specific to AP. It's going to have all your modules there. So if you have an interrupted sales batch, it's going to be in there. If you have an interrupted GL batch, it's going to be in there. In the batch recovery window, you can restrict your view to a specific series. You can display all batches or marked batches. I would say move to marked batches if you've got multiple batches that you're releasing, just to review them before you click the continue button. You have your mark all and unmark all buttons to make life easier for you. You have batch ID, So this is the batch ID. So this is a sales transaction entry transaction. You have your origin, so it stopped at the journal entry. You have a status. Now sometimes you'll see different things. Here under status, we currently see transaction error, edit required. And that just means there's something wrong with the transaction. Usually it's either a posting date or it's your distribution accounts, okay? Another status you might see is printing interrupted or posting interrupted. So it may tell you different statuses based on where the batch was interrupted. Here you see the comment to the batch. So here we have transactions from service, the number of transactions that are currently in the batch that is stuck, and then the frequency of the batch, if it's single use or multi-use. So here, to simply continue the batch, so if you have a batch that says here printing interrupted or table update interrupted or posting interrupted, you would simply just check the box and click continue, and that'll finish your transaction posting. When we see an error such as this one where it says transaction error edit required, we're going to have to select the batch and then click continue. And what that does is it releases the batch for us to edit. So here we can go under financial and batches under transaction. If it wants to open for me. Here you would pick the document, say this one, and then you could click on transactions. You'd review the transactions. Most of the time, I suggest that when there says edit transaction required, the best thing for you to do is to just go back to the batch ID. So we come here, we select the batch, and we click on the little printer icon. And this is going to print us an edit list. So I'm going to tell it to print to screen here. And then here, it'll tell you if it's a batch specific error, it's going to give you an error message up here. And if it's transaction specific error, it'll give you the error message down below the distributions of that invoice. Okay, you can see here this currency ID is not selected for this posting account. That's specific to this 1360. It's due to the multi-currency module. We'd actually have to identify the currency ID for this posting account, and then we'd be able to post the batch. All right. Most of the time you'll see though that the distributions don't tie. That's what I see a lot in payables. And the reason we see that a lot in payables is if we go back to the invoice window in payables, so we're going to go to purchasing, transactions, and transaction entry. And we're going to enter in an invoice. Alright, I'm going to select my vendor. I'm going to enter my document number. Here under purchasing, I'm going to put $100. Alright. We're going to go to distributions. Everything looks hunky-dory. And then we look back at the invoice and we say, oh wait, the check was really for $100.10. Alright. If we post the batch right now, we have distribution errors because I've currently already opened up the distribution window. So you'll notice when I go back to distributions that my distributions are still back for the original $100 that I entered as the purchasing amount. We have a couple options here. We can manually update the amounts ourselves. So we can make it 110. Or if you're accepting the defaults for your transactions, you can click on default. And it says resetting these defaults will delete all current entries. So what it's telling us here is if we've entered multiple expenses, when we click default and click change, it's going to remove those additional expenses. So I'm going to click on change, and it's going to update the information for you. Most of the time in my client systems, clicking the default will actually clear out the expense account. All right, so it's going to look more like this when you click default. So you'll need to re-enter the expense amount. Now, if we had entered the invoice and if we had not opened the distribution window to add our expenses before changing this amount, it would have updated the distribution window for us. But because we opened up the distribution window before making our necessary changements here, it did not update the distribution information. So we needed to go back into that window to make the updates. All right. That's what I usually see in payables. It's either one of that scenario, or usually the posting period is closed. So you'll need to go in and make changes to that. The next thing we're going to talk about is processing 1099s and printing your 1096 form. So the first thing you want to do when you're printing 1099s is you want to make sure all your vendors are marked as 1099 vendors. There's two ways you can do this. You can go into GP Smart List. If you have an idea of who your 1099 vendors are, you can go under Purchasing, and you can go under Vendors. And out of the box, GP provides a smart list called 1099 vendors. And if you notice here in the search criteria, it's a simple default. It's just saying the 1099 type is not equal to not a 1099. So here it's just simply showing to you your vendor ID, the name of the vendor, and their 1099 type. Another thing you might want to add to this, so if we click on columns here, click on add. I like to do 1099 amount year to date. So here you can see who you should expect a 1099 form to print for. Excuse me, let me take a sip of water here. Hope we have a question. Is this only in GP 2013? No, the 1099 vendor smart list is in all GP versions that I can remember. You should be able to see this in smart list. I think smart list came out with version 9, maybe version 8. So everybody should be able to have this smart list because everybody should be on a supported version of GP. Right? If you're not sure who all your 1099 vendors are, you can always click on vendors. You can go to your columns and you can add 1099 type. I like to put this at the very beginning. So what I do is once you add a field, it automatically goes to the bottom. And I just click on this arrow with a straight line to send it all the way to the top. So then you can sort by your 1099 type just by clicking on the column header here. And you can review your vendors and make sure that they're all marked who should be marked as a 1099. If you find a vendor that should have been a 1099 but isn't a 1099, there's a few steps that we're going to need to take. So I'm going to do a little trick here. I'm going to highlight this vendor, and we call this in GP the Go-To button. So we have a couple options here. We can go to the vendor address maintenance window, the vendor inquiry, the vendor transaction. I'm going to go to the vendor address maintenance window. And then I'm going to sneak back to the vendor maintenance window. So here, so I can get to vendor maintenance that way, or you can simply just go back to purchasing, go to cards, expand cards here, and then click on vendor. It's going to open up your vendor maintenance window. We're going to click on options. And then here over on the middle right side of the screen, you can see your tax type, not a 1099, and then we can change it to miscellaneous. Now, if a vendor is not marked as a 1099 vendor, all the transactions that you enter for that vendor will not have a 1099 amount associated to the transactions. So we're going to have to go through and to update the 1099 amount. All right. One thing I do want to show you as well is under the transaction entry screen, when it comes to 1099s, let's see if I can restrict by 1099 type here. So I'm entering in this invoice for a 1099 vendor. And say I'm going to do the invoice for $250. Now you'll notice the 1099 amount always defaults to $250. Well, if some of your invoice is for expenses, that's not technically a 1099 amount. So we'll need to reduce the amount of the 1099, say to $200. If you have a vendor that uses multiple boxes in a 1099 form, so you may have some that use box 7, some might use box 2A. If you need to change the box for a specific invoice, you can click on this little arrow box. It'll ask you what tax type it is. We'll say miscellaneous, and then you can change it to the box that's appropriate for the invoice. All right. If you just need to enter the amount for the 1099 that's associated with the vendor, so say the vendor is set up to be 1099 miscellaneous box 7, and it's supposed to go to that for that invoice, you just need to enter in the amount. You don't need to worry about entering the box information. This box information here is new to, I believe, GP 2010 and 2013. To edit 1099s, for GP 2010 and 2013, you're going to go under Cards and 1099 Details. If you're on a version prior to GP 2010, I believe most of my clients are on GP 10. Some of my clients are on GP 10, so you may need to come to this Vendor Cards Summary window. But the window looks the same, okay? So here we select our vendor. You'll notice that the vendor lookup is restricted to only those vendors that are marked as 1099. So if you don't see the vendor here, you need to go back to the vendor card maintenance window and make them 1099. So I'm going to select Beaumont here. We'll have a tax type of miscellaneous dividend or interest. It defaults to the tax type of the vendor on the vendor card. We have display. Now, if you're making changes, you're going to want to do month. If you're just looking at the information, you can select year. Okay, so we have our year here. We can say 2014. And if they have any payments, it'll show you. If you need to make changes, you're going to want to go to month. Now, does it have to be the same month as the invoice was incurred? No. Some of my clients will enter all the 1099 information, especially for vendors that weren't marked as 1099 but should have been. They'll enter the whole amount in 1 month. As long as it's between January and December, it'll print on the 1099 form. If you need to make changes such as minimizing the amount of the 1099 or something like that, you're going to want to find a month that actually has a 1099 amount in it to reduce it to the correct amount. All right, so now that we've marked all our vendors as 1099s that should have been marked as a 1099, and we've updated our 1099 details, we're going to actually want to print our 1099. So we're going to go under Routines, expand the button here, and we're going to click on Print 1099. Here you'll see our company ID, our company name defaults, our address ID defaults with our address information. You'll have to enter in your federal ID number. You'll want to enter the 1099 year. If you need to print 1099s for a previous year, it is possible. Just simply change this year to the correct year. You have your 1099 type. So here we're printing miscellaneous. You have your form type, which is continuous or single feed. Continuous is the old printer type we all remember that have the little holes on the side and all the pages are actually attached to each other that were perforated and you could rip them off. That would be continuous. Single feed is like most modern day printers. So we'll select printer single feed. And then we can restrict our vendor IDs that we want to print. We can restrict by vendor name, vendor class, or type. And then we have an option to order the order that it prints in. So we can sort by vendor ID, vendor name, vendor class, or type as well. You'll notice over here in the GP 2013 version, we now have print 1099 form. We're going to print our alignment form, or are we going to print our 1096 form? Excuse me. We're going to print our 1099 form. Prior to printing to our 1099 forms, I always print an edit list. So here you can see which vendors are going to print. Let's see if we can pull a year that actually is going to print something in my test version. Well, can't seem to find a year. Oh. And then you would just simply click print and it will print your 1099s. New in GP 2013, let me make that clear. New in GP 2013, we can now print our 1096 forms. So now you're not using a typewriter or manually writing in your 1096 form. You can simply highlight the 1099-6 form under your print section and click print. And it'll print out your 1096 information. Any questions about printing a 1099? No? All right. The next thing I want to talk about is reconciling your payables data. Most of my clients, to print their to reconcile their AP module to the journal ledger module, they'll print a historical trial balance out of AP for a specific date. Make it to screen. They'll select print. They'll print this information. And then they're pretty much trying to make sure that this amount, this due amount, is the same amount that's in their AP accounts. So then they'd go into the general ledger. So we're going to go to financial. We're going to go to reports. We're going to click a trial balance report. They'd go in and they'd create a new option. Here they'd enter a date cutoff. So here we'll do January 1 to say 05/31. Oops. They'd select the year and they'd print it to screen. Right. And then they're reconciling their AP account for that amount. Now, in GP 2010 and 2013, there's a new way that you can reconcile your AP module to GL. You simply go to Financial, and then under Routines, we see reconcile to GL. So I'm going to click on reconcile to GL. In GP 2010 and GP 2013, this window looks a little different. All right. In GP 10, we're not going to see this reconciliation number or reconciliation date. You're going to have your date range. It's going to ask you what your module is. And then you won't see this in 2010 either. You won't see the output file or the reconciliation information down here at the bottom as well. So what we're going to do is we'll let the reconciliation number default for us. We'll let the reconciliation date default. The date range, we're going to enter in a date range. We'll leave that as it is right now in March. And then in modules, you need to identify which module you're reconciling. So here we're reconciling payables management, but you can also reconcile receivables management, inventory, and the bank reconciliation module. So I'm going to select payables management. In GP 2013, you're going to need to select an output file. So I'll make this 3, that's good. And then here under accounts, you're going to want to identify all AP accounts that you use in the AP module when entering in transactions. What I mean by that is when you go into purchasing and you go to transactions, transaction entry, when you go into the distribution window, if you use a different payables account here than just the 121, the default, you're going to want to list that in the Excel, in our accounts that we select. So back to the window, we come here and we're going to select all our accounts payable as accounts. So you can see here in my demo image, I could possibly use all of these AP accounts in my AP module. So you'd want to include all of them. Okay. So we'll just add them here one by one. I think we have the other one already. Yep. All right. And then once we're ready, we click on process. And it'll take a few minutes. And then Excel is going to open up and we see this pretty Excel sheet. I want to make it clear to you that this doesn't automatically reconcile your AP to the general ledger. This reconciliation process is simply giving you a starting point on why your GL may be off from your AP and vice versa. You'll notice that there are 3 sections to the Excel sheet. There's unmatched transactions, potentially matched transactions, and matched transactions. If you have any transactions listed under unmatched transactions, that means a journal entry was either posted in the general ledger but didn't originate in AP, so you'd see that on the right side of our screen, or you have a payables transaction such as an invoice that you've posted in AP but it's never been posted in the GL. All right. We have potentially matched transactions. So we have some listed here. Then we have our matched transactions. And then if everything was good to go, then these numbers would tie perfectly and we'd say, yes, we're reconciled. If you see anything here under unmatched, let's first start talking about transactions that appear on the left side. If transactions appear on the left side of our Excel sheet, the first thing I would do is I'd go under GP and I'd go to the financial module and I'd go under badges and I would look up to see if there's any AP batches still out there that need to be posted. Okay, you're going to see transactions that say PM check. You may see them like they are posted here where it just has the 5 letters, or you may see it with the 5 letters and then a serial number at the end. You're going to want to make sure that all your payables transactions are posted for that month that you're trying to reconcile. So I'd come in here and make sure that everything looks good and then post those if necessary. If anything appears on the Excel sheet on the far right of our screen, that means under unmatched that you entered a GL transaction to the AP account that originated in the general ledger, that did not originate in payables. So there's a couple things you need to think about here. Why is the transaction there? Should it be there? Or should we have entered it originally in the payables management module? So you'll want to correct any issues there, either by correcting the journal entry, voiding the journal entry, and re-entering it in payables. You'll notice in the GP 2013 window, once we have processed the reconciliation number grays out, the date range and module gray out, and we have the information here of our subledger and our general ledger. So here we have beginning balances, and then on the other end, under ending balances, we have the ending balance for subledger and GL and our difference. In a perfect world, our difference on our ending balance would be 0. Be like, yay, we're done. But this new feature in GP10, and I think it started in GP10 or 2010, is information only. It's not going to automatically reconcile the module for you. We have a question. Oh. I don't see this in 2010. You went into financials and then routines and then selected reconcile to GL. Yes, I did select reconcile to GL. It is a new module or a new feature, so if you have security set up and you're not considered a power user to the system, you're not going to automatically see this. You're going to need security privileges given to you so that you can see the screen. I know that the module was there in GP 2010, so if you're in GP 2010 or GP 2013, you should be able to see the window. And then the last thing we have to cover today is to complete the year-end close procedures. The first thing you're going to want to do to complete the year-end close for payables is make sure that all payables transactions are entered and posted for the year. So we'd go under transaction entry, or we'd go under batches, and we'd make sure that we posted all of our AP batches for the year. Another great place to go during this process is series post. Here you can select multiple batches to post at one time. You'll also want to make sure that under financial, that those payables batches are posted as well. I like to get it all out of the way at the beginning. Once you post all your AP information, the next thing that you're going to want to do is your 1099s. You're going to look at your 1099 information. So here, like we did before, you would go in, identify which vendors are your 1099s by using the Smart List. So you're going to go under GP Smart List. And under Purchasing Vendors, you'll review your 1099 vendors. You'll make any 1099 adjustments that you need to make. If for the calendar year there has been 1099 form changes, you'll want to go out to Customer Source and download the payroll update, which will include the 1099 updates as well. Download that and run it against your system, which will upgrade your GP databases as well to make sure that your 1099 forms are correct. One thing that we should probably go over that I didn't mention before for your 1099s is if the government ever decides to change the 1099 amounts, starting in GP 2010, we were given the ability to change the amount that prints on the form, the minimums for allowing the forms to print. And to change those amounts, you just simply go to Setup, Payables, and then you go to 1099 Setup. And then here you just select the tax type, and then you can make any changes that you want here. So we can make the non-employee compensation be, say they want the minimum to be $500 now. We can change it to $500. You do not need to print your 1099s prior to the year-end close. I know in the Microsoft Knowledge Base article that gives you the step-by-step instructions for payables, that it does suggest that you close the year prior to posting any new fiscal or calendar year transactions. And the reason that you want to close, they suggest that, is because when you're looking at your inquiry screens, so if we come here to look at payable summary. That might not be a good example. Let's find a different inquiry screen. Let's look under vendor yearly. If you don't close the year prior to posting any future calendar year, so for example, if we didn't close the calendar year 2012 before we posted in AP the 2013 transactions, our amount since last close is not going to be a good view into what has happened since the beginning of the year. Because if we close, say, in March, that's when this information rolls forward. Okay, so if we for instance close on March 1st, our amount since last close for last year is going to be all transactions that were entered in 2012 plus the 3 months in 2013 that we entered transactions before we closed the year. And then our year to date would start March 1st. All right, and then here you have your life to date. So your amount since last close inquiry window is not date sensitive. It's actually sensitive to when you run the year-end close process. When you're ready to run the year-end close, we're going to click on Routines and then Year-end Close. Here you have the option of closing all your fiscal year or your calendar year. And you want to make sure your print report is checked. You cannot reprint the year-end close report, so I always suggest printing it to PDF and storing it somewhere because it ends up usually being a large file. It's not usually like 1 or 2 pages. So you'll want to probably print that to PDF and store it somewhere. And then by bottom here we have last closing date. This is generic information, just telling you the last time we closed payables. So if your calendar year and your fiscal year are the same, say January to December, then everything's great and you can say select all. If your fiscal year starts in July and ends in June, and your calendar year, you'll want to close at separate times. All right. And you simply just click Close Year. And you can see here, this is a test database that doesn't get much activity, and we've got an easy 22 pages for our year end. You'll notice in GP 2013 as a new feature, which I think is awesome, is that when you go to print, so I always like to print a screen and then I like to print a printer. And what does everybody forget to do? They forget to change their printers, right? From their defaults. Well, now in GP 2013, you can change your defaults. So we can simply just go to print setup. The print setup window should open. And then there you'd be able to change between your printers. So there you can change to Adobe. In the past you did that and the report just ignored you. It only printed to what you defaulted to. But now when you click the brief print button, it'll ask you if you want to change it to go somewhere else. Now what is the difference? What happens when you close the year? Well, here's what changes. Your amount since last close information is moved over to last year, as you can see here in this window. And in your calendar year view, your 1099 amount is moved from year to date to last year. Those are the two big changes when you're closing payables. Once you've closed payables and you've closed the sales module, if you use the sales module, then you'll want to go in and close the tax year. To close the tax year, you simply go to Financial. You go to Routines. And we should see in here year-end tax close. Where are you? They moved it on me. So then you'd be able to close your tax year. All right. And then you'd be able to close your general ledger by going to Routines and then year-end closing. Does anybody have questions about closing the year? We have about 45 more minutes left in class, so I'd like to also maybe go over another new topic or a new feature in payables, and that's reprinting your check stubs. Oh, we have a question. Let's go to the question. Okay, we want to repeat on the AP year-end closing. Okay, to summarize it. So first you're going to want, before you run the year-end close process, you're going to want to identify and make any changes to your 1099s. If your 1099 form or the form that the IRS provided changes, there will be a payroll, it'll say payroll year-end update. That will include any 1099 changes, so you'll want to download that and update the databases with that information. Then you'll want to make sure all your AP transactions for the year are posted, and then you can run the year-end close for AP. And you just simply, to run the year-end close, you go to Routines and then year-end close. And then you can choose all if your calendar year and your fiscal year are the same, so January to December. If you say your fiscal year starts in July, you can just select calendar year and close that. Your calendar year close moves your 1099 amounts from year to date to last year. Your fiscal year close moves all your other information to last year. And then one key point to remember is when you go into your inquiry screens. So let's go back to your vendor yearly information here. One key point you'll want to remember is your amount since last close is not date sensitive. So that's not saying, oh, we closed the year for 2012, amount since last close starts January 1 of 2013. That's not what amount since last close means. If we close the year March, we closed 2012 on March 1st of 2013, amount since last close is March 1st, 2013 moving forward is going to be your year-to-date information. All right. You can, I believe, change your amount since last close information for a vendor. And there are steps in the knowledge base article that the AP year-end knowledge base article that tell you how to update your year amount since last close if you so choose to. We had one other question. How do we change the printer or options permanently? To change your printer options permanently, GP identifies your default printer first by the default that you have set up for the computer. So if we go to our little start button in the bottom left, we go to devices and printers. You can see here I don't have any physical printer set up because I'm using an image, but I have an XPS writer and I can send to OneNote. The printer icon that has the little check mark is the one that your system automatically defaults to. So if I go to print setup here, it just does not want to open up in this image. It would identify that XPS document writer. If you want to, like if you have a specific printer that you always want checks printed to, and that may not be the computer right next to your workstation, you can set up named printers. And so what you can do is you go to Tools, Setup, System, and Named Printers. It's going to give the machine that you're currently on a machine ID. So you see here, my machine is called GP2010-B, so that's the machine ID it gives it. All right, so it'll give you some messages here. We said name printers requires the default printer and to order work correctly. We say okay. Say okay. You probably won't get all those error messages because you'll actually be set up. But in the named printers, you can set up certain activities to go to specific printers. So for example, say you have a Micker printer, a printer set up specifically for Micker checks. You can say that's in the AP's office, but their AP person is out and you're printing checks. We can set up named printers, and no matter what workstation you print that check from, it's going to print on that AP's printer. All right, so you can do that by that. And then if you need to make any other changes, you can do by your system. You can change your print setup here, and that should affect the whole system as well. That's only going to be affected during this login session. Once you close GP and log back in, it's going to take the default printer from your actual computer defaults. All right. And then the last feature in GP 2013 that's new to the module is to reprint your check stubs. So if you need to reprint a check for a vendor, you simply go to the inquiry screen and you say transaction by vendor. You select the vendor ID. Let's see. Oh, that person doesn't have any payments. Let's go to someone that has payments. Here we go. You can select the payment. We open the payment. So I don't know if everybody knows, but anything that's blue and underlined can send you somewhere else in GP. So I have highlighted this payment here, and if I click on document number, that opens the payables payment zoom. And then here we can review the check information, and then if we want to reprint the check stub, we can click on recreate check stub. And then we can send that to screen printer or file, and then it reprints the check stub for us. It's going to look like the remittance form when you have invoices that you have more than, I believe, 12 invoices on a check. It's going to look more like that remittance form. Does anybody have any questions? We have about another 30, 40 minutes left in class, so if you guys have any questions, we can go over those questions now. If not, I have another feature that we can talk about that's not really on the schedule, but is a good topic to discuss. And that's the credit card feature. It comes directly out of the box for GP. So I'm going to set up credit cards, you just go to GP, Tools, Setup, Company, and then Credit Cards. You can also get to this window by clicking on Administration, and then under the Setup screen, you can come under Company and then Credit Cards. The credit card feature in GP allows you to set up credit cards. Pay an invoice by that credit card. When you pay an invoice with a credit card, the system automatically creates an invoice for the vendor associated to that credit card. So a good example would be American Express. All right. So here we'll select one that's already set up. You can see America Charge. We say it's used by the company, so it's used by our company, and we associate it to a specific vendor ID. All right. And we're going to click Save here. Then when we come in and we create an invoice, so here we're going to pay by credit card. We're going to select a vendor, enter information, say we're going to our conference, so we're paying our travel company $25,000 for our tickets. All right, I'm going to pay with credit card, so I'm going to pay the $25,000. When I pay by credit card, it's going to ask me which card I'm using. I'm going to say the America Charge. We can enter in a receipt number if a receipt number was given to us, or we can just let it default to credit card and we can click OK. You'll notice under distributions that we have our expense account and our AP account. You'll also know that notice that the AP account is associated to a type of called cash, which means we're actually paying this invoice. So we're going to go OK with that, and we're going to post the transaction. And it's going to make me save it and send it for approval, so I'm not going to be able to post this. Yeah. Once the transaction and the invoice is posted, what the system will do is it will create transactions for that vendor. So we go under transactions and we pull up America Charge. We can possibly see these invoices. Okay. That's not a good example. Let's see if we can find one that's good. Now what the invoice will look like is when we select the invoice, and it opens up in the payables window. It will view, you'll see the invoice information, and then under distributions, it'll be blank. Okay, the system is not doing anything in error. It created the invoice in the back end, and because we created the invoice in the back end, there's no distribution information tied to the credit card portion of the invoice. The invoice is created, and then in theory, at the end of the month, you should be able to look at your credit card statement and look at the outstanding invoices for that vendor and say, check, 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 check. Yep, everything looks good on my credit card statement. And that's the credit card module. I have a few clients that use that. I have one client that uses it, that each employee has a separate credit card, and then I have a lot of clients who use it that have a company credit card. So they have one credit card number for the whole company. And that really comes in handy at that point. Anybody have any questions about the credit card module? If not, I will end class early. If you guys would like a CPE certificate for attending class today, please request one from Jeannie Mahoney. You can reach her at, via email at jmahoney, which is JMAHONEY at Brittonford.com, and she'd be happy to assist in getting you that certificate. Just tell her that you were attending the AP Advanced online training course. All right. And I'm going to stop recording at this time.
Stacey, you have one more question.
Oh, I do? Oh, I do. How do you enter credit card payments before the statement arrives? Well, here's how it works. When you're using the credit card feature in GP, you're entering in the original invoices. So it's like going to Staples and swiping your card. You're actually entering in the invoice for Staples. So it allows you to see what you've purchased from Staples. And then you say, hey, I've paid that by credit card. That invoice will be created in the back end when you say you've paid that invoice by credit card. Okay, so you're not actually entering in the credit card invoice. Once the invoice has been created in the back end for you by the system, then you can view your invoices and pay those just like you would pay any invoice that you hand entered. Anybody else have any questions? All right. Oh, we might have one more. The credit card feature it's out of the box. If you have payables, you have the credit card feature. You're going to see it under administration to set up the credit cards, and then you're going to go under so your administration, setup, company, and then credit cards. Here you would enter in a credit card name like American Express. You're going to say it's used by the company. It's marked as a credit card, and then you select the vendor that it's associated to. Okay. Then you'll notice that when you enter in your invoices for other vendors, like your Staples vendor, you'd be able to select that credit card. You can also do it under manual payments. So if we go under manual payments here, we can select we paid the invoice by credit card, and we can select the credit card. Remember, in that setup, we identified what vendor is associated with the credit card. Any other questions? All right, well, I'm going to end the class then. Everybody have a great day.